a $10,000 check, sitting on a white tablecloth, between a billionaire's daughter and a man whose work boots still had job site mud on the soles. The check was not a gift. It was a door being shut. Chicago in November. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. 40 floors above the river, in a restaurant where the waiters wore better suits than most men earn in. A woman in a charcoal blazer slid a fountain pen back into her portfolio and waited for the inevitable. She had done this before. Not this exactly, but the version of this where money ends conversations before they become problems. It always worked. Except this time the man across the table reached into his wallet and pulled out a $10 bill. He set it on top of the 10,000, didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, just looked at her with the particular calm of someone who has decided, before walking into the room, exactly what he is worth, and pushed everything back. The Thursday morning Gary Morrow drove to the South Side Home Depot. He was already losing an argument with himself. Not out loud. He wasn't that far gone. But the argument was there, running underneath everything like an engine that wouldn't quit, burning fuel without going anywhere. 3 years. That's how long the blueprint folder had been sitting on his passenger seat, not on the dashboard, not in the back. The passenger seat, where a person would sit, where someone could look at it and ask what it was. Nobody ever asked, because nobody ever rode in Gary Morrow's van. The folder was navy blue, cardboard, soft at the corners from being moved around so many times without ever being opened. Inside it, 43 pages of hand-drawn architectural plans for a mixed-use building he'd designed during his 3rd year at the Illinois Institute of Technology before the money ran out and the dream ran out with it. He'd kept the folder the way some men keep old jerseys. Not because they'll ever play again. Because throwing it away would mean admitting something they're not ready to admit. He turned onto Western Avenue, and the van rattled over a pothole that had been there since the Obama administration. The left rear shock was gone. Had been gone since March. He kept meaning to fix it. He kept meaning to do a lot of things. The client's name was Deborah Wills. She lived in a new construction townhouse in Beverly, and she had hired Gary 6 weeks ago to remodel her master bathroom. The job should have taken 12 days. It took 19, because she changed the vanity selection twice, and the tile vendor backordered the floor material without telling anyone. Gary had absorbed the extra days without charging more. That was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 was letting her sign off on the grout color over text message rather than in person. The grout she'd confirmed in writing was Sherwin-Williams antique white. She now claimed, with the confidence of someone who had never mixed grout in her life, that what she had envisioned was something closer to aged ivory, that these were different colors, that Gary should have known. The difference between antique white and aged ivory, for anyone keeping score, was approximately the distance between nothing and nothing. She was withholding the final payment, $4,200. Gary had called twice and texted 3 times since Monday. Each response was some variation of "I need to think about it," which was a polite way of saying she knew he needed the money, and she was comfortable with that knowledge. So, Thursday, South Side Home Depot. He needed a box of 3-inch screws and a replacement battery for his DeWalt because the old one was holding about 40% charge, and he had a kitchen cabinet installation starting Monday that he could not afford to delay. He had exactly enough in his business account to cover the supplies and 1 tank of gas before the account officially went negative. He'd done the math 3 times in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven on Halsted because doing the math again felt better than accepting the math. It was raining, not a storm. Chicago in November didn't bother with drama. It just sent down this cold, gray, persistent drizzle that coated everything in a film that made it look like the city was slowly giving up. The temperature was 38 degrees and dropping. Gary pulled into the Home Depot lot, found a spot near the Contractor bays, and sat in the van for 20 seconds longer than necessary, breathing, not thinking about the blueprint folder, not thinking about Deborah Wills or aged ivory grout or the DeWalt battery or the left rear shock absorber that needed replacing. He got out of the van. He got his cart. He went inside. He found the screws. He found the battery. He stood in the hardware aisle for a moment longer than he meant to, looking at a display of contractor-grade tape measures he didn't need, because sometimes standing in a hardware store is the closest thing to peace a man in his situation gets. The smell of cut lumber drifting from the wood section. The clean logic of organized fasteners. Everything in its bin. Everything labeled. Nothing ambiguous. He pushed his cart out through the contractor exit and back into the gray afternoon. That's when he saw the truck. It was parked at the far end of the lot, away from the contractor bays, away from the cart corrals, out in the section of the lot that normal people avoided because it was the furthest from the door. The truck was a Ford F-150, late 90s. The red paint faded down to the color of dried brick. Rust had worked its way around both rear wheel wells like something patient and inevitable. The tailgate was down. Standing behind it, both hands gripping the base of a cast-iron table saw, was an old man. He had to be in his mid-70s. Canvas jacket, the kind that had been washed so many times the original color was just a memory. Faded denim. A Chicago Cubs cap pulled low over a weathered face that had more lines in it than a road atlas. The table saw sitting on a wooden pallet at his feet was enormous. Old cast iron. The kind they stopped making sometime in the 1980s because cast iron is heavy and expensive and requires skilled people to operate, and American manufacturing decided it was done investing in all three of those things. The saw had to weigh close to 200 pounds, maybe more. The old man had his fingers hooked under the base, boots planted on the wet asphalt, jaw set. He breathed in. He heaved. The saw came up an inch, maybe two. Then his grip slipped on the wet iron, and the machine crashed back down onto the pallet. And the old man stumbled backward, hit the truck's bumper with his lower back, grabbed it to keep from going down, and stood there, chest heaving, rain gathering on the brim of his Cubs cap. His face had gone from determined to gray in about 4 seconds. Gary stopped walking. Most people didn't stop. A woman in a white Lexus rolled slowly past the end of the row, her wipers going, not even glancing over. A contractor with a flatbed cart full of cement bags angled away from the scene and kept moving. Nobody was being cruel. People are not usually cruel. They're usually just in a hurry. And someone else's problem in a parking lot on a cold Thursday afternoon is very easy to reclassify as not your problem. Gary stood there. He looked at the old man. The old man had straightened up and was already reaching for the saw again, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has never in his life asked for help and has decided, consciously or not, that today will not be the day he starts. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold. From the effort of the first attempt. Gary thought about his father. That was an involuntary thing, the way those thoughts always are. His father, Dennis Morrow, had been the same way. The same refusal, the same jaw. Dead at 63 from a heart attack that the doctor said had probably been building for years. The kind that comes to men who don't slow down and don't complain and don't ask anyone to help them lift heavy things. Gary had been 21. He had not been there when it happened. He had been 3 states away in his first semester at IIT, designing buildings he would never build. He left his cart next to his van and walked over. The old man heard him coming and looked up fast. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, and immediately suspicious. The kind of eyes that have learned that strangers approaching in parking lots generally want something. Hey, Gary raised a hand. Easy, non-threatening, that thing's a beast. I got it. Gravel and grease in the voice. Completely certain. I know you've got it. Gary stepped into the puddle near the man's boots without hesitating, because hesitating would give the man time to refuse more firmly. But that tailgate's high and the asphalt's slick, and if one of us throws out a back, I'd rather it be me. I'm Gary. The old man looked at him for a long moment, blue eyes doing their evaluation. Then he looked at the saw. And he looked at the height of the tailgate, and he did the math that Gary had also done, and pride lost to physics. Richard. All right, Richard. You take the left, I take the right. We get it to the lip, then push. Don't lift with your back. Legs. Ready? Richard grunted. They crouched together. The cast iron was cold enough to sting through Gary's work gloves. He worked his fingers under the heavy iron lip and felt the weight of the thing before they even started lifting. Real weight. The kind you don't find anymore. The kind built into things during an era when durability was considered a virtue rather than a cost problem. 1, 2, 3. They stood. Gary's boots slipped a fraction of an inch on the wet asphalt and he caught himself, shifted his weight, kept lifting. His forearms burned. Richard was pulling his weight, genuinely. The old man was strong, in the way that men who have worked with their hands their entire lives are strong. A different kind of strong than gym strong, quieter and more stubborn. The saw scraped along the rusted edge of the tailgate. Gary said push. They pushed. The saw slid into the truck bed and hit the ribbed metal floor with a sound like a safe being dropped, heavy and final and satisfying. Gary shook out his hands, stepped back, caught his breath. Richard stood against the side of the truck, breathing through his nose. He pulled a folded handkerchief from his pocket, the cotton kind, gray with use, and wiped the rain off his face. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, not looking at Gary directly, appreciate it. Don't mention it. Richard reached into the cab without another word and came back with a steel thermos, old, dented on one side. He unscrewed the cap, which was also the cup, and poured something dark and steaming into it. Held it out. Take it. Fresh this morning. Gary took the cup. Black coffee, no sugar. So hot it almost burned through the plastic grip. He took a sip and felt it hit the back of his throat, like an argument he had won. They stood there in the drizzle. Two men who did not know each other, not talking because there was nothing that needed saying yet. Richard looked at the saw. My daughter thinks I need an electric one. He patted the cast iron like it was a horse. Bought me some plastic thing from the internet. Broke in a month. He shook his head slowly. This iron here. You know when they stopped making cast iron saws? 1987. This one's older than you. Still cut straight. They don't make things to last anymore. Richard looked at him sideways. They don't make anything to last anymore. People included. He paused. The rain fell steadily on the brim of his cap. My daughter. She's done well for herself. Successful. Lives up in one of those glass buildings downtown. His voice was not critical. Not exactly proud either. Something more complicated than either. But she doesn't trust a soul. Thinks every person who smiles at her wants something from her. Gary handed the cup back. Maybe she's had reasons to think that. Richard took the cup. Drank. Looked out across the wet parking lot like he was watching something play out on a stage only he could see. Reasons. Sure, there are always reasons. He pulled a small spiral notepad from his chest pocket, the kind that cost 99 cents and lasts forever, and a stub of pencil shorter than his thumb. You do contracting? Yeah, what kind? Residential mostly. Remodels, kitchens, baths, some light commercial. Richard nodded, uncapped the pencil, held the notepad up. Give me your number. Gary stopped. He looked at the old man. Looked at the saw. Looked back at the old man. Richard, you don't owe me anything. It was a lift. I know I don't owe you. The gravel came back sharp and unapologetic. I want your number because I might need a wall knocked down. Give me the number or don't. Your choice. Gary gave him the number. Richard wrote it down, shoved the notepad back into his chest pocket, gave Gary a single nod that conveyed more than most speeches Gary had ever heard, and got into the driver's seat. The truck started immediately, which was either a miracle or a testament to obsessive maintenance, and coughed a brief cloud of exhaust into the damp air before settling into an idle that had a particular kind of authority to it. The F-150 reversed out of the spot, turned, and rattled toward the lot exit, the rusted wheel wells disappearing into the gray afternoon. Gary stood there for a moment. Then he went back to his van, got his cart, put his screws and his battery in the back, and drove north on Western Avenue. He thought about the old man for maybe 90 seconds. Then he thought about the Monday cabinet installation, and the Deborah Wills situation, and the battery percentage on his old drill unit, and Richard Calhoun evaporated like rain. 4 days passed. The rain stopped and the temperature dropped 10 degrees, and the puddles in the lot outside Gary's building froze solid overnight. He was on his back under a kitchen sink in Bridgeport on Monday afternoon, sweating through his shirt despite the cold, trying to convince a corroded P-trap coupling to cooperate, when his phone buzzed in his back pocket. He ignored it. He ignored the next buzz. At his break, standing outside on the back steps of the house, with a gas station coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, he looked at the screen. 2 texts from an unknown number. The first, Gary. Richard Calhoun, hardware store. Lunch tomorrow. 1 p.m., 450 N Michigan Avenue, the Meridian Room. Floor 20. The second, which had come 4 minutes later, don't be late. Gary read them twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket. Then he took it out again. He typed the Meridian Room into his browser, and what came back was a restaurant page with dark photography and ambient jazz, and the phrase "an elevated dining experience for the discerning Chicago professional," which meant no prices on the website because people who ate there didn't need to see prices, which meant it was the kind of place Gary had walked past 100 times and never gone inside. Which was fine. That was fine. He typed Richard Calhoun into the search bar. Calhoun Freight Solutions. Founded 1978. Midwestern Logistics and Distribution. Headquarters, Chicago, Illinois. Fleet of over 300 trucks. Annual revenue. He had to click through to a business intelligence site that required an email to access, which he gave them, because he was suddenly invested, last reported, at $480 million, privately held. Founder Richard James Calhoun, 74, who had stepped back from day-to-day operations 4 years ago. Current CEO Laura Calhoun, 32. Gary looked at his hands. Plumber's crack in the right index finger knuckle that hadn't fully healed since September. Calluses along the heel of each palm where tool handles sit. Permanent grout shadow in the skin, creases that no amount of scrubbing fully removes. He turned them over. Back. Over. He typed back, "Richard, you really don't have to do this. The coffee in the lot was plenty." The reply came in 40 seconds, "I insist." Floor 20. 1 o'clock. "Don't dress up." Which was almost funny. Almost. He told himself he wasn't going. He told himself this while he finished the P-trap coupling. Would you treat them with kindness? He told himself this while he loaded his van and while he stopped at the auto parts store to see what the shock absorber would run him $280, which he didn't spend, and while he made himself a dinner of scrambled eggs and toast in his apartment because the refrigerator situation was not ideal and eggs don't expire. He told himself he wasn't going right up until he set his alarm for 7:30 and laid out his cleanest button-down shirt, the dark navy one he wore to bid presentations and twice to court for permit appeals that had gone sideways on clients who then blamed him. He wasn't going. He went. He showered at 6:45 and was out the door by 9 because he had a couple hours on a residential repair in Hyde Park that he could knock out before heading downtown. And he did that because standing still costs money, and by 12:15 he was on the red line headed north. In his navy button-down and dark jeans and the leather boots he'd saved up for 2 years ago and still treated with oil twice a year because they were the nicest thing he owned. He did not wear a tie. He did not own a tie. He did not feel, looking at himself in the scratched subway window, that he needed one. He was a contractor. He was going to lunch. He was not embarrassed by what he was. Would you treat them with kindness? He got off at Grand, walked the 2 blocks to Michigan Avenue, and felt the city change around him the way it always does when you cross from the neighborhoods into the corridor. The buildings got taller. The sidewalks got cleaner. The people stopped making eye contact. Not rudely. Just the way people stop making eye contact when they've decided that acknowledgement costs something. Gary had grown up on the South Side. He'd worked on jobs all over the city for 9 years. He was not intimidated by the Magnificent Mile, but he was aware of it the way you're always aware of a room you weren't born to be in. 450 North Michigan was a tower of pale stone and glass that announced its seriousness from a block away. Gary pushed through the revolving door into a lobby with 40-foot ceilings, white marble floors, and the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. He found the elevator bank marked floors 15 through 25 and rode up. The elevator was wood-paneled. It smelled like something that wasn't quite cologne and wasn't quite wood polish, just expensive air. Floor 20. The doors opened. The Meridian room was all dark hardwood and low amber light, and a bar on the left that stretched the length of the wall, populated by men in wool suits and women in silk that probably cost more than Gary's van was worth. The hum of conversation was quiet and controlled, the kind of quiet that takes effort to produce. No one was laughing loudly. Everyone was performing, very convincingly, not performing. Gary walked to the hostess stand. The woman behind it looked at him the way people in those places always looked at people like him. Not hostile, just efficiently calibrating. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" "I'm meeting someone." "Richard Calhoun." He said the name without hesitation because hesitation would have cost him something he couldn't afford. She checked her tablet. A pause that lasted half a beat too long. "I don't have a reservation under that name." Gary was pulling out his phone when a voice came from behind him. Not Richard's voice, not gravel, not 74 years old. He turned. She was standing 5 feet away, and she had been standing there long enough that she had watched him check his phone and watch the hostess and shift his weight. She was in her early 30s, tailored charcoal blazer over a white blouse. Dark hair pulled back into a knot at the nape of her neck, so precise it looked like it had been done with measuring instruments. She held a leather portfolio under one arm. Her eyes were green, a sharp and particular shade that Gary would later not be able to fully describe except to say that they were the color of something that has learned to see clearly in the dark. She was beautiful the way certain things are beautiful, when they are also dangerous. The kind of beautiful that makes a person forget for a second to read the room correctly. Gary read the room correctly. Just a second late. "Are you Gary?" "Yeah." He kept his voice even. "I'm Laura, Richard's daughter." She did not offer her hand. "My father isn't coming." Gary let that land. "Is he all right?" "He's fine, he's at home." The green eyes were steady, completely unaware this lunch is happening. "I intercepted his schedule this morning." There was a silence that had weight to it. "Table for 2, please, Sarah." Laura addressed the hostess without breaking eye contact with Gary. "The window booth." "Of course, Miss Calhoun." The hostess was immediately deferential in the specific way that people with money produce in service staff without trying. Laura turned and walked toward the restaurant floor, and Gary stood at the hostess stand for 1 full second, experiencing the distinct physical sensation of having walked into something he had not been warned about. Then he followed her. Because what else do you do when you're standing in a $40 an hour lobby, wearing your best button-down, and the person you came to meet just materialized out of nowhere with a leather portfolio and an expression that made it clear she had been planning this conversation since before he left his apartment. The window booth was in the corner. The Chicago River ran below them, silver gray in the November light, the bridges and glass towers of the loop stacked behind it, like an argument for civilization that Gary wasn't sure he was buying this afternoon. Laura sat with the kind of posture you have when you've spent years being the youngest person in every room and learned that sitting up straight is the cheapest form of armor. She set the portfolio on the table, rested both hands on top of it, and looked at Gary. A waiter materialized, specific and quiet, the way good waiters in expensive restaurants are specific and quiet, present without being there. "Still water. No ice." Laura without looking up. "Just tap for me." Gary, also without looking up, because he was looking at Laura. The waiter vanished. Across the table, Laura opened the portfolio. She did not preamble. She did not warm up. She lifted out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the white tablecloth between them and Gary, looked down at it, and felt the temperature in his chest drop about 5 degrees. It was a background check. His background check. Full. The kind that cost real money to run. The kind that pulled financial data and court records and employment history. He could see his business account number redacted, but the last 4 were visible. He could see the notation about the IIT enrollment from 3 years ago. He could see the late payment flag from 18 months back on a materials supplier he'd fallen behind on during a slow quarter. He kept his face neutral. He was good at keeping his face neutral. Years of dealing with clients who were wrong had given him that particular skill. You ran a background check on me. I run background checks on everyone who comes into contact with my father. She said it the way someone says something they have said many times before, and have long since stopped feeling the need to justify. Richard is the founder of Calhoun Freight Solutions, formerly the majority shareholder, net worth that I will not specify out loud in a public setting. He is 74 years old. He drives a truck that belongs in a salvage yard and insists on going to hardware stores himself and on speaking to everyone he meets as though they are neighbors and not strangers. He is trusting in a way that is. She paused, and Gary noticed that the pause was not for effect but for precision, not safe. Gary sat back against the leather booth. He looked at the background check on the white tablecloth. He looked at Laura Calhoun. He was aware that he was angry. He was also aware that showing it immediately would be a mistake. What exactly do you think my angle is? I don't know yet, that's why I'm here. I helped an old man lift a saw in a parking lot. I know what it looks like. No. He kept his voice down. Careful. Level. Because the restaurant was quiet, and he was Gary Morrow from the South Side in a navy button-down, and this was not the place to raise his voice. Not because he was afraid of the room, but because he was better than that. I don't think you do. Because what you're describing, the thing you're implying, is that I staked out a Home Depot in the rain on the south end of the city and waited for a 74-year-old man in a rusted F-150 to show up and buy a cast-iron table saw so I could offer to help him lift it. And then, he paused because the logic required a moment. What? What exactly is the plan you've worked out in your head? Something moved behind the green eyes. Not softness. More like acknowledgement. People do desperate things for money. I'm not desperate. She glanced at the background check. I'm managing. He said it flat, without apology. Because antique white grout and $4,200 withheld, and a business account running thin was not desperation. It was Tuesday, and he had been managing Tuesdays for 9 years. And I'm not whatever you're afraid I am. Laura looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the portfolio and her hand came back with a checkbook. Black leather cover. Fountain pen, the actual kind with a weight to it. She unscrewed the cap. Wrote, tore the check cleanly from the book. Set it on the tablecloth between them, on top of the background check, and slid both toward Gary with 2 fingers. The would you treat them with kindness. The way you slide something across a table when you want to make clear that the transaction is concluded and the other party's presence is no longer required. Gary looked down. $10,000. Pay to the order of Gary Morrow. Written in a hand that was practiced and certain. He looked at the number. He looked at the comma. He looked at the zeros. He was aware of what $10,000 meant in real terms. It was the Deborah Wills payment times 2 plus 6 months of his rent. It was the left rear shock absorber and 3 new battery packs and a full set of blades for the circular saw that was getting dull. It was the kind of money that turns a bad year into a manageable one. He was aware of all of that in the space of about 2 seconds, because he was not stupid, and he had not pretended for a single moment of his adult life that money doesn't matter. Then he looked up at Laura Calhoun. She was sitting back slightly, the lean of someone who has just played what they consider the decisive card. There was something in her face that was almost relief, the preemptive relief of someone who believes they are about to solve a problem neatly. Every man has a price. She had found his. Transaction complete. The folder could be closed. Gary felt something settle in him, not anger. Heavier than anger and quieter. The exhaustion of a world that genuinely could not conceive of a person doing something ordinary without a reason that could be quantified and neutralized. He had helped Richard Calhoun lift a table saw in the rain because the old man was going to hurt himself. Because Gary's father had been that old man and nobody had stopped, and Gary had lived with that for 9 years. Because it had taken 30 seconds and cost nothing, and was simply the thing a person does when they see another person struggling. That was all. That was the entire story. He reached into his back pocket and took out his wallet. He was not rich enough to carry a money clip. He opened the wallet and took out a $10 bill, folded once. He placed it on top of the $10,000 check. Laura frowned. Gary slid both of them back across the white tablecloth toward her. The 10 is for the water. He slid out of the booth and stood, and he looked down at her and kept his voice quiet because the room was quiet, and because what he was about to say did not need volume to land. Your father told me about you in that parking lot. He said you were successful. He said you didn't trust anyone. I thought he was just being an overprotective father. He looked at the check. He wasn't being overprotective. He was being accurate. A pause, short and deliberate. You have more money than most people will see in 3 lifetimes, and you just spent it trying to prove that a stranger who helped your dad load a truck is a criminal. That has to be a miserable way to live. Laura's mouth opened slightly. Not much. Just enough. I don't want anything from your family. Gary picked up his jacket from the bench. Next time your father needs help with something heavy, hire someone. That's what the money's for. Would you treat them with kindness? He walked out of the booth and through the restaurant, and he did not look back because looking back would have cost him something, and he was already running short. He took the stairs. 20 floors. His boots on the concrete steps echoed in the stairwell, and he counted the sound because counting is something to do when the blood is loud in your ears and you are trying not to replay a scene you cannot unwrite. He hit the lobby and pushed through the revolving door, and the Chicago November hit him like a hand flat on the chest, cold and immediate and honest. He stood on Michigan Avenue for a moment and breathed it in. Then he walked to the red line stop, went home, changed back into work clothes, drove to a job in Lincoln Park, where he spent the rest of the afternoon pulling old drywall off a bathroom wall until his shoulders were screaming, and his hands were raw, and the Meridian Room and its dark hardwood and its ambient quiet felt like something that had happened to someone else in a different city. He blocked Richard's number that night. He did it without ceremony, standing in his kitchen eating peanut butter on toast because the egg situation had not improved. He went to the contact, hit block, put the phone face down on the counter, drank his water, looked at the blueprint folder on the coffee table in the next room, the navy cardboard gone soft at the corners, looked away. He was almost entirely certain it was over. It would turn out wrong about that, the way you are wrong about things when you have underestimated what a 74-year-old man with a rusted truck and a specific kind of stubbornness is capable of deciding. But that was 3 days away. For now, Gary Morrow stood in his kitchen, ate his toast. The radiator knocked in the corner. The city moved outside the window, indifferent and enormous and carrying on, the way cities carry on, without knowing or caring that somewhere in a parking lot 4 days ago, in the rain, between 2 strangers and a cast iron table saw, something had started that did not yet have a name. 3 days is not a long time. Unless you are waiting for something you have told yourself you are not waiting for. Then 3 days is approximately forever. Gary did not wait. That was the thing. He genuinely did not wait. He went to treat Monday work morning on the cabinet installation in Bridgeport, and the job went clean, the way jobs go clean when you've prepped properly and the client isn't home to ask questions. He went Tuesday to a quote in Evanston for a basement finishing project, a couple in their 40s who wanted a home office and a half bath and had a budget that was almost realistic. He went Wednesday to the lumber yard on Cermak to price out materials for a deck repair in Pilsen that was supposed to start in 2 weeks. He ate. He slept. He did not look at Richard Calhoun's blocked number, because blocked numbers do not show you anything. That is the point of blocking them. He did not think about Laura Calhoun and the check, and the way her mouth had opened slightly when he pushed it back across the tablecloth. Except he did. But he did it the way you think about a dream in fragments, at inconvenient times, when his hands were busy and his brain had stopped supervising itself. The leather portfolio, the fountain pen, the specific quality of her silence when he said what he said about miserable ways to live. He did not know if he'd been right or wrong to say it. He knew he'd meant it. He knew he'd meant the other thing too, the thing about not and wanting anything from her family, because he had meant that completely and without reservation. He was not a person who said things he didn't mean in order to sound better than he was. He had enough actual problems without manufacturing the additional problem of being dishonest. So, 3 days. Wednesday evening. Gary in his apartment. Not a bad apartment if you were being honest. 3rd floor of a 6 flat in Bridgeport. The kind of building that was put up in 1922, being great people who believed that walls should be thick, and floors should be level, and ceilings should be high enough that you don't feel like you're living inside a box. The lath and plaster had been drywalled over sometime in the 90s, badly, but underneath it Gary could feel the bones of the place, and the bones were good. The radiator in the corner knocked and hissed on a schedule that was entirely its own. The kitchen window looked out over the back alley and the brick rear wall of the building behind. Not a view, but a thing to look at, which is different. Would you treat them with kindness? He was eating take-out pork fried rice from the place on Halsted that he ordered from when the week had been long enough that standing in front of the stove felt like one more demand he couldn't meet when someone knocked on his front door. Not a polite knock. Not the tentative knock of a neighbor who is sorry to bother you. A heavy knock, 3 times evenly spaced, with the flat of a hand. The knock of someone who has knocked on a lot of doors in his life and has no interest in being ignored. Gary set his container down, walked to the door, checked the peephole out of pure Southside habit. Richard Calhoun, same canvas jacket, same Cubs hat, standing in the dimly lit hallway of Gary's building with the patient, planted stillness of a man who intends to wait as long as necessary. Gary looked at him through the peephole for 2 full seconds. Then he looked at the corner of the hallway that the peephole didn't quite cover, the part just to the left, in shadow. Someone else was standing there. He knew before them with kindness. He knew before he opened the door. He knew in the way you know things when you have been thinking about something without admitting you were thinking about it. He opened the door. Richard was looking at him directly, without apology, without preamble. He was not a man who believed in preamble. Behind him, 4 feet back, hands shoved into the pockets of a heavy wool coat that was doing its best, against a hallway that smelled of old radiator heat and someone's dinner, was Laura. She was not in a blazer. The suit was gone. She looked smaller without it. Not physically smaller, just less armored, and tired. Genuinely, structurally tired, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep because it's not coming from the body. Richard looked at Gary. You blocked my number. I did. I drove around for 20 minutes looking for parking. I don't have a lot of control over parking in this neighborhood, Richard. No. Richard looked past Gary into the apartment, then back at Gary. His jaw was set the way it had been set in the parking lot before Gary walked over, the jaw of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. She has something to say to you. You going to make an old man stand in a drafty hallway, or are you going to let us in? Gary looked at Richard, then at Laura, who was looking at the wall beside the door, with the focused attention of someone pretending they are somewhere else. Her coat collar was turned up. There was something about the set of her shoulders that was not what Gary expected. Not cold, not surgical, just present. In the way that people are present when they have run out of the energy required to be performing. He stepped back and held the door open. Richard walked in like he'd been their base before, because that was how Richard walked into rooms, with the unself-conscious authority of someone who has spent 74 years treating the world as a place that belongs to him as much as anyone. He looked around the apartment without commentary, registered the lath and plaster beneath the drywall the way Gary had known he would. Richard reached out and rapped his knuckles against the door frame, once, twice, listening to the sound. His eyes moved across the ceiling, the baseboards, the formica table, salvaged from a diner demolition in Wicker Park, that Gary had stripped and refinished and was genuinely proud of, even though it cost him nothing. Richard nodded slightly to himself at something only he was grading. He went to the refrigerator, opened it, looked inside, pulled out a can of the cheap Lager Gary kept for the same reason he kept aspirin, not because he used it much, but because running out felt like a bad sign. Richard cracked the tab, took a pull, carried it to the formica table, and sat down in one of the vinyl-backed chairs with the ease of a man who has decided that where he sits is where he belongs. He pointed at the chair across from him without looking up. Laura was still in the doorway. Gary looked at her. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her. The apartment was not large, and with 3 people in the kitchen living space, it became smaller in a way that had nothing to do with square footage, more to do with the weight of things that needed to be said taking up room. As she didn't unbutton the coat immediately, she stood near the door for a moment, looked at the blueprint folder on the coffee table, looked at the chipped formica, looked at the stack of kindness, certification textbooks on the kitchen counter that Gary had been working through at 6 in the morning before jobs because the commercial contractor exam wasn't going to pass itself. Then she unbuttoned the coat. Underneath it, she was wearing a gray wool sweater. Simple. No logo. The kind of thing that costs either $40 or $400 and looks the same either way. She sat in the chair Richard had indicated, put her hands in her lap, looked at the table. Gary leaned against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. He did not offer coffee. Not because he was being hostile, because he was waiting. And offering coffee would have changed the temperature of the room before the thing that needed to happen had happened. Richard drank his beer, looked at Laura, didn't say anything. Would you treat them with kindness? Just looked at her, with the particular look of a father who has driven 20 minutes looking for parking and is not going to drive back without the thing getting done. Laura looked at the formica table. There was an old coffee ring near the edge, faded but permanent. She traced the outside of it with her index finger. Around. The radiator knocked. The city moved outside the windows, unaware. I was wrong. Her voice was quiet. Not the restaurant voice. That voice had been a controlled instrument. This was just a voice. Not just tactically wrong. I was cruel. And I'm sorry. Gary let it sit. He did not rush to accept it or qualify it or ease the discomfort of it because the discomfort was part of it, and she needed to feel it. Not as punishment, as honesty. Why did you do it? He kept his voice level, genuinely asking, not twisting the knife. She looked up at him. Her eyes were slightly red at the rims, not from crying, more from the sustained effort of not crying in a situation that warranted it. Because 4 years ago my mother died. She said it without breaking. Stating a fact. A terrible one. Cancer. It was fast. 12 weeks from diagnosis. My father, she glanced at Richard, who was looking at his beer can with the total absorption of a man hearing something he already knows and still finds hard. He stepped back from the company. He didn't handle it well. He started moving differently. Going to bars he hadn't been to since the 70s. Buying things he didn't need at auctions and flea markets. Talking to strangers. She paused. Gathered something. Continued. He met someone. A contractor. Residential like you. Said he was going through a rough stretch. Divorce. Losing his business. My father didn't give him a loan. That would have been one thing. He opened a line of credit with no ceiling and brought the man into our home and treated him like she stopped. Cleared her throat. Like a son. He called him that. He used that word. The radiator knocked. Gary did not move. 14 months. The man used that line for 14 months before I found out. By then it was just under $2 million. But when I put it in front of my father, with documentation, with bank records, he didn't believe me. Not immediately. Her voice dropped to something close to a whisper, but harder than a whisper, edged. 3 months. 3 months I had to sit with him and work through it, and watch him defend someone who was robbing him, who was laughing about it with his friends, who said she stopped again. The pause was longer this time. When my lawyers finally got the man on record, he said that old men are easy marks. He said it like it was obvious. Like my father deserved it for being kind. The apartment held the silence without difficulty. Old buildings are good at that. So yes. Laura's chin came up. Not defiant exactly. More like someone making sure they are seen clearly. Not asking for approval, just for accuracy. I live in a glass building, and I don't trust anyone. I took over a company at 28 that I was not ready to run, and I became the person who protects my father because he will not protect himself, and someone has to do it. And when I saw a 30-year-old contractor who was in debt making friends with my father in a hardware store parking lot, I did not see a good Samaritan. She looked at Gary without flinching. I saw it happening again, and I moved to end it. Gary stood against the counter. He thought about the parking lot, the rain, the saw, the thermos and the bad coffee. The thermos and the bad coffee and the way Richard had said, "She doesn't trust a soul," with something in his voice that was not just a father's complaint, something older and more helpless than that. He thought about the check on the white tablecloth and the exact quality of Laura's expression when he pushed it back, which he had been turning over for 3 days without admitting he was turning it over, and which he now understood differently. Not arrogance, fear, dressed in arrogance because arrogance is cheaper to wear in public. He pushed off the counter, walked to the refrigerator, took out 2 more cans, set one in front of Laura. She looked at it like it had appeared from somewhere unexpected, and cracked his own and pulled out the 3rd chair and sat down. $2 million is a real number, he said. It wasn't about the money. I know. He leaned forward, forearms on the formica. It was about the 3 months. Watching him not believe you. He paused. That's the part that doesn't go away. Something moved across Laura's face that was not composure and not the collapse of it. Something in between. She picked up the beer can. Didn't drink from it. Just held it in both hands like it was warm, which it wasn't. I accept your apology. Gary said it plainly. No performance around it. But I need you to understand one thing. I work for every dollar that goes in my account. With my hands. Some weeks it's barely enough, and some months it isn't enough at all. And that is my business, and I manage it, and I don't ask anyone for anything. When you put that check on the table, you treated me like a problem you could buy your way out of. Don't ever do that to me again. Laura looked at him steadily. You have my word. Which was when Richard set his beer can down on the formica with a solid crack that made both of them look at him, and he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a piece of paper folded into quarters and tossed it onto the table between them. The fold was creased deep, like it had been folded and unfolded several times. We have business to discuss, Richard said. Gary looked at the paper, then at Richard. Open it. Gary unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn plan. Not an architect's plan. A practical man's plan, done with a ruler and a decent pen. Accurate in the way that someone who has spent 50 years making things work is accurate. A floor plan of a large rectangular building, labeled in Richard's handwriting main floor. Approximate square footage noted. Rough positions of structural columns marked with X's. Along one wall, wood. Along the perpendicular wall, metal. In the center bay, automotive. And in the upper right corner of the plan, a smaller rectangle labeled Office MGMT. Gary looked at it for a long moment. He recognized what he was looking at. Not just the floor plan, the logic of it. The workflow built into the layout, the way the shop areas were positioned relative to the presumed access points, the way the management office sat where it could see the whole floor. Whoever drew this had thought about how people would actually move through the space. That was not nothing. I bought a building, Richard said. Brick warehouse, 1940s construction. Pilsen, 2 blocks south of the rail yard. Ground floor is 8,000 square feet. I'm turning it into a community trade center. Woodworking, metalwork, automotive. For young people from 19 on up who want to learn to work with their hands instead of staring at screens their whole lives. Gary looked up from the drawing. The GC I hired to do the build-out has been on site for 3 weeks. Yesterday, the building inspector pointed out that the framing in the east load-bearing zone is not compliant with the spec I approved, meaning the man used cheaper materials and cut the framing schedule to finish faster and pocketed the difference. Richard's voice was calm. The calm of someone who has been genuinely angry and has already moved through it to the other side. I terminated his contract this morning. I need a replacement, Richard. Gary set the drawing down carefully. I do residential work. Solo. No commercial license, no commercial bond, no crew. A warehouse conversion is a different category entirely. You need a licensed GC with commercial experience. I have a licensed supervisor. Richard held up one thick finger. Friend of mine, 30 years in commercial construction. Retired. happy to co-sign as owner-authorized supervisor under the city's owner-builder provision. I have a union crew of 12 men I've known since the 1990s who still work because they like working. What I do not have is someone to run the site. Someone who can read a structural plan, coordinate the trades, and make decisions in real time without calling a committee. He pointed at the drawing. You have 3 years of architecture coursework. 3 years I didn't finish. 3 years more than the man I just fired. Richard leaned back in his chair. Not smug. Matter of fact. You know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. You know what happens when framing doesn't match spec. I watched you look at that drawing for 45 seconds and I watched your eyes move to the column positions first. That is not an accident. Gary looked at the drawing again. He did not want this. Wanting, it felt dangerous in a way he couldn't fully articulate. The way stepping onto ice feels dangerous even when you're pretty sure it will hold. This was not a bathroom remodel. This was not a kitchen cabinet job. This was the thing he had imagined doing when he was 20 years old, drawing buildings on graph paper in a rented room in Logan Square, running a build-out of real consequence, reading structural plans, coordinating a crew, making decisions that mattered. He had told himself that life was not going to give him that. He had told himself that on purpose. He had told himself that on purpose because it is safer to not want things you are not going to get. Richard was watching him with the patient attention of someone who has made a career out of reading what people decide before they say it. I buy my own materials, Gary said. I don't sign off on anything I haven't physically inspected. Richard did not smile. He did something more restrained than a smile. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Standard commercial rate plus 20%. Done. And I'm going to need to see the existing structural reports before Monday. Already pulled. They're in my truck. Gary looked at the hand-drawn plan on the Formica table. The building he had not yet seen. The crew he had not yet met. The work that was somewhere between the thing he was and the thing he had stopped letting himself imagine becoming. He looked up. Richard was watching him. Laura was watching him. And her expression was something Gary had not seen on her before. Not in the restaurant. Not in the doorway. It was attention without agenda. Just watching. Just present. I'm going to need a copy of the owner-builder permit documentation and the supervisor co-sign agreement in writing before I step on that site. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded envelope. Set it on the table. Already drafted. Gary stared at it. Then at Richard. You brought this. I brought this. You were that sure I'd say yes. Richard picked up his beer. Finished it. Set the empty can down. No. I was sure you'd say yes to the right version of it. That required me to know what the right version was. He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Monday, 6 in the morning. I'll text you the address. He looked at Laura. You good to get home? Yes. Her voice was different than it had been when she walked in. Not softer exactly. Less braced. Richard walked to the front, opened it without fanfare, and walked out into the hallway. And a moment later, Gary heard the door to the stairwell open and close, the sound of a man who does not wait for elevators. Gary and Laura sat at the Formica table. The apartment was quiet except for the radiator, the beer cans between them. The hand-drawn floor plan still lying open on the table. He's been planning this for 6 months, Laura said. The building, the workshop. He started it 3 weeks after the last GC came on site, which means he fired the man in his head before he fired him officially. He just needed the inspector's report to make it formal. She turned the beer can slowly in her hands. He does that. He makes decisions months before he makes them. Gary looked at the floor plan. He drew this himself. He draws everything himself first. He says architects make things too complicated. She paused. He's usually right. You've seen the building? Once. It's a good building. 1940s brick construction. The walls are 3 courses deep. The bones are better than anything being built now. She looked at Gary. He wouldn't have come to your door if he wasn't certain about you. Richard doesn't do things for the gesture. If he made the drive, it was because he already knew what the answer was going to be, and he needed the paperwork signed. Gary looked at her. And you? Why did you come? She was quiet for a moment, not evading, thinking. Because I owe you an apology that can't be done through a lawyer. He nodded once, picked up the floor plan and began folding it back along its creases. The east load-bearing zone. What did the inspector's report say exactly? Would you treat them with kindness? And just like that, the conversation changed and they were talking about the building, about rebar spacings and vapor barriers and the difference between what the original structural drawing specified and what the dismissed GC had actually installed, and Laura knew more than he expected, which surprised him and then didn't surprise him. Would you treat them with kindness? Because she ran a company with 300 trucks and logistics infrastructure across 4 states, and understanding physical systems was probably not optional. They talked for 40 minutes. Gary made coffee, actual coffee, not because the conversation required it, but because it was getting late, and the coffee was something to do with his hands. Laura drank hers with nothing in it, same as Richard, which Gary filed away without knowing why he was filing it. The Formica table with kindness. The Formica table between them was covered with the floor plan and the structural report pages Gary had extracted from the envelope and arranged in the order that made sense. The column grid first, then the load path diagram, then the inspection photos. At some point, Laura stopped looking at the papers and started looking at Gary's hands. Not in a weird way. The way you watch someone work when you are learning something about them that words would have taken longer to say. You know what you're looking for, she said. Not a question. The GC framed the east wall to the drawing but used the wrong lumber grade. The drawing called for 2x10 SPF number 2. He used number 3. Same dimensions, 17% less load capacity. On a clear span bay this wide, that's not a rounding error, that's a structural problem. Would you have caught it before the inspector? He looked at her. I wasn't there yet. Would you have caught it? Yes. She nodded, not satisfied exactly, more like something confirmed. He walked her to the door when she left, because it was late and the hallway was dim, and she put her coat back on, in that methodical way she did things, each button from the bottom up, and in the doorway she turned and looked at him, and there was a moment brief, not quite definable, where the negotiation was over and they were just 2 people standing in a doorway, and the city was going on outside, and neither of them spoke. Monday, she said finally. 6 in the morning, Gary said. She walked down the hallway. He watched her reach the stairwell. She pushed through without looking back, and the door closed and the hallway was dim and quiet. And Gary stood in his doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before going back inside. Monday came. Gary was at the Pilsen warehouse at 5:55. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd spent Sunday afternoon driving by it twice without stopping to look. The way you drive by something you are trying to understand the weight of before you have to be responsible for it. It was on a block that was half industrial and half the kind of residential that has been next to industrial so long. It stopped caring. The building was 3 stories. The top 2 floors vacant and not part of the project. Ground floor only. The brick was old Chicago common brick, dark red, the mortar cracked in places but the walls plumb, genuinely plumb, which in a building this age was either luck or the legacy of someone who had taken the work seriously. The loading bay doors on the south face were steel, painted over several times, the last coat peeling in long strips. The windows were intact. That was something. Richard was already there when Gary pulled up, standing in the loading bay with his thermos. Same setup as the parking lot, same jacket, same hat, like a man who has found his uniform and sees no reason to change it. Beside him was a man Gary did not know, 50s, medium height, a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, with the kind of posture you get from carrying heavy things for decades. He wore a canvas vest over a flannel shirt and held a rolled set of drawings under one arm. Thomas Briggs, Richard said, gesturing. 31 years commercial construction, most of it in Chicago. He's your co-signed supervisor. Briggs looked Gary over without making it theatrical. The way tradespeople assess each other, quickly, taking in hands and posture, and the particular quality of attention. I'm told you've got 3 years of architecture school and 9 years field experience. That's right. Architecture school doesn't mean much on a site. I know. Field experience means something. Depends on what kind of field. Briggs held out the rolled drawings. Tell me what's wrong with the East Bay framing. Not a test announced as a test. Just a question. The kind that has a real answer. Gary took the drawings, unrolled them on the hood of his van. He had already looked at the structural report from the envelope. He knew what he was looking for. He found the East Bay section in 40 seconds, traced the column grid with one finger, found the beam specification, found the lumber call-out. Then he looked up at the building and at the framing visible through the open loading bay door, and he found what he was looking for there too. Lumber grade. Drawing calls for SPF 2. What's up there is SPF 3. You can see it in the stamp on the end of the beam from here. He pointed. Would you treat them with kindness? On a clear span this width with the dead load of the equipment they're planning to run in this bay, you're looking at a deflection issue inside of 5 years. Maybe less, if they run the heavier automotive lifts they've got on the equipment list. Briggs looked at where Gary was pointing. Looked at the drawings. Looked back. How'd you see the stamp from this distance? I've been staring at lumber stamps since I was 19. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he rolled the drawings back up and tucked them under his arm and looked at Richard. He'll do. He looked back at Gary. I'll sign the permit. You run the site. You have a problem you can't solve, you call me first. You have a problem with the inspector, you call me first. You make a structural modification to the approved drawings, you call me before you do it and we discuss it. Everything else is yours. Understood. Briggs shook Gary's hand, nodded at Richard, got in a pickup truck Gary hadn't noticed at the far end of the block, and drove away. Richard sipped his thermos, looked at the building. Crew's here at 7. 12 men. All of them have been working union longer than you've been alive, and all of them are going to test you in the first hour, not because they're hostile, because that's how it works and you might as well know it. How'd you know I'd pass Briggs's question? Richard looked at him sideways. Because you spent 45 seconds staring at my hand-drawn floor plan and went straight to the column positions. A man who looks at the columns first knows what holds a building up. He poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it across. Besides, I drove around for 20 minutes looking for parking in your neighborhood. I don't do that for a guess. The crew arrived at 7. 12 men. Richard was right on the age. Every one of them had more years of experience than Gary had years of life. They came in trucks, and they came quietly, and they stood in the loading bay, and looked at Gary with the collective. Would you treat them with kindness? Unhurried attention of people who have seen a lot of site managers come and go and have learned to reserve judgment without broadcasting the reservation. Gary did not make a speech. He unrolled the modified drawings, the corrections to the East Bay, framing that he and Thomas Briggs had roughed out on the phone Sunday evening, and spread them on a sheet of plywood he set across 2 sawhorses, and he started talking about the work. What needed to come down? What needed to go back up correctly? Who was best positioned for which phase of the remediation based on the skill sets Richard had listed for him? He assigned the framing remediation to the 2 men whose background Richard had flagged as heavy timber framing. He put the electrical rough-in team on the West Bay, where the metalwork stations were going, because they had the most to do and the longest lead time. He kept the most senior man, a carpenter named Gerald, who had not said a single word since arriving, on direct quality check for the lumber grade verification, because if anyone was going to catch a repeat of what the previous GC had done, it was going to be the man with 38 years of framing experience and a look in his eye that said he had caught it before. Gerald looked at Gary when Gary assigned him. Just looked. Then he nodded once and picked up the drawings. That was the first thing Gary built in the warehouse. Not a wall, not a floor, just a crew that was willing to move in the same direction. It cost him 3 hours, and everything he knew about reading rooms, and it was more exhausting than any physical work he had done in recent memory. By noon, the East Bay framing was half down, and the correct lumber was on a delivery truck 2 miles out. Richard was in the back of the building arguing with the electrician about conduit placement along the east soffit, which was a legitimate argument that Gary let run because Richard was technically correct and the electrician needed to be persuaded rather than overruled. By 2 in the afternoon, Gary was covered in drywall dust and construction debris and had made 6 decisions, 3 of them about materials and 3 of them about sequencing. And 2 of the 6 he was second-guessing internally while maintaining external certainty, because external certainty is the currency site managers trade in. The second week, Laura showed up on a Friday afternoon. Trench coat. Tablet. She stood near the entrance and reviewed whatever was on the tablet and did not look up much. Site oversight, she told Gary when he walked over. Investment monitoring. He said fine and went back to work. The third week she came without the tablet. The 5th week she came in a Carhartt jacket and jeans that had seen some wear, and she didn't stay near the entrance. She walked the floor. She looked at things. She asked the occasional question that was specific enough to be real, not the kind of question people ask when they are performing interest. Would you treat them with kindness? She asked about the vapor barrier installation on the north wall, specifically about the overlap specification at the floor-to-wall joint, which was not a question a person asks unless they have read the spec and found something they want to understand better. Gary answered it without making it a moment. Just answered it the way you answer a real question. Because it was a real question. And then on the afternoon of the 6th week, in the first week of December, the city inspector walked the East Bay. Gary was in the back of the building when it started, and he knew from the quality of the silence that something had happened. Would you treat them with kindness? The particular silence of a worksite people have stopped because something requires collective attention. He came around the corner and found the inspector mid-40s, gray vest, city ID badge, clipboard standing at the east column line with a set of drawings and a look on his face that Gary had seen before. The look of someone about to deliver information that is going to ruin someone's afternoon. The look that said the foundation wasn't right. Not the framing. The framing Gary had remediated was correct. But beneath it, the original slab pours at the east column bases, done before Gary arrived on site, done by the previous GC's concrete sub, had missed the required embedment depth by 2.5 inches on 3 of the 4 column bases, which meant the framing above was correct, and the structure below it was not, which was the kind of problem that multiplied. Gary stood next to the inspector and looked at the column bases, and felt the specific weight of a problem landing. Not panic. Panic is not useful. But the full, clear weight of what this meant. The East Bay, framing the remediation he had just completed, was going to have to come down again, a second time. The column bases would need to be cut out and re-poured with the correct embedment depth and cured for 28 days minimum before the framing could go back up. 6 weeks of timeline. $180,000 in unplanned cost, rough estimate, give or take based on the concrete sub's rates, and how much of the adjacent slab needed to come up to access the bases. He stood very still. He did the math in his head. He did it twice because the first time he did it he wondered if he'd added wrong. He had not added wrong. Richard appeared at his shoulder. Gary had not heard him approach. Richard looked at the column bases, looked at the inspector's drawings, looked at the notation. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Who did the original pours?" "Your previous GC's concrete sub. Not part of my team. I know that." Richard's voice was even. "I'm establishing the fact for the record." The inspector confirmed the finding in writing before he left. Gary walked him out. Would you treat them with kindness? When he came back into the warehouse, the crew had gone quiet in the way crews go quiet when they are waiting to find out if the project they are working on is still a project. 12 men. Some of them had turned down other work to take this job. Some of them had rearranged their schedules around a timeline that was now being pushed by 6 weeks through no fault of their own. Gary stood in the center of the main bay. He spread the modified drawings on the plywood sheet on the sawhorses. He did not call the crew over. They came over because that is what crews do when the person running the site has earned enough authority for people to move toward it voluntarily. He explained the problem. All of it. No euphemism, no minimizing, no passing of blame beyond the factual attribution of where the error originated. Then he explained the remediation plan, which he was working out in real time, talking through it as he traced the drawings, and which, by the time he reached the end of it, had a shape he believed in. East Bay framing comes down for the second time. Column bases get exposed and repoured by a concrete sub he had a relationship with and would call this afternoon. 28 days cure. Framing goes back up. In the meantime, the West Bay and the center automotive section could continue on schedule and would be substantially complete by the time the East Bay was ready for framing. The project would not lose 6 weeks on all fronts, only on the East Bay, and the East Bay finish date would move by 6 weeks and no more. I know some of you turned down other work for this timeline, Gary said. I'm going to make 3 phone calls this afternoon to line up supplemental work for anyone who needs it during the Eastern Bay pause. I can't promise all 12 of you will be needed full-time for the next 6 weeks. I can promise that when the East Bay is ready, I want this same crew. Nobody gets replaced because of a concrete pour that happened before I got here. Gerald, the carpenter, looked at Gary for a long time. Then he picked up his framing hammer and said, "Let's talk about the demolition sequence," which was how Gary understood that he had improbably and incompletely, and at considerable personal cost, in terms of stress hormones and sleep hours, become a site manager that a crew of experienced men was willing to follow into a problem they had not caused. Richard was on the phone in the corner of the building. Gary heard him say, "Concrete sub and certificate of insurance, and you have a crew available in 2 weeks or not," before Richard walked outside and the conversation became inaudible. Laura had arrived at some point during the inspector's visit and Gary wasn't entirely sure when. She was standing near the east column line, looking at the column bases, and when Gary walked over she looked up. "How bad?" Her voice was quiet. "Bad but manageable. Nothing that can't be fixed. It'll cost and it'll take time and the timeline moves."
He paused.
"This was on the previous GC. I know. I want that documented clearly. Already in motion. I called our attorney on the way in." She looked at the column bases again. "The crew staying?" "For now. I made them a commitment." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression. Not relief exactly. More like the recognition of something she had been looking for without fully knowing she was looking for it. He makes commitments like that too. A small nod toward where Richard had disappeared. To people who work for him. He never breaks them. Good policy. "It's not policy," Laura said. "It's just who he is." She looked at the column bases one more time. Then at Gary. "What do you need from me?" He told her. "A licensed concrete sub with current city certification, available within 2 weeks, with a crew capable of doing the repour to the inspector's spec." Laura made a call before she left the site. By 4:30 Gary had a name and a number, a company on the west side, that had done city-certified pours on 3 projects in the last 18 months and was available in 9 days. Driving home that evening, Gary sat in traffic on the Dan Ryan and thought about the day, the inspector, the column bases, the crew, Gerald and the framing hammer, the call to the concrete sub, Laura on the phone before she'd been on site for 20 minutes, not managing it, just solving the part that was hers to solve. He thought about the things she had said. It's not policy. It's just who he is. He drove home. He ate. He set his alarm for 5:30. He looked at the blueprint folder on the coffee table, the navy cardboard soft at the corners, 43 pages of a building he'd designed at 20 years old. He didn't open it, but he moved it off the coffee table, deliberately, and set it on the shelf above his desk, where he kept the things he was working on. That was something. Word count, 4,312 incomplete, continuing to reach 8,809,000 target. Gerald had a system Gary didn't understand until the 3rd time he watched it. Every morning at 6:55, before the crew officially started at 7, Gerald walked the entire floor. Not with drawings. Not with a clipboard. Just walking, looking at what had been done the day before the way a doctor looks at a patient, checking for something specific that only he knew how to read. He never explained this. He just did it. And twice in the first 2 weeks, Gary had arrived early enough to watch the walk, and then spent the rest of the day trying to identify what Gerald had seen and recorded in his head. Both times, by mid-afternoon, Gary figured it out. A vapor barrier overlap that had been done wrong and would have wicked moisture into the framing. A joist hanger installed without the full nail count. Not catastrophic. Not yet. The kind of thing that announces itself in year 7 as a problem nobody can trace back to the moment it was made. Gary said nothing to Gerald about this. Gerald said nothing to Gary. But after the second time, Gary started arriving at 6:45 and walking a portion of the floor himself before Gerald's walk began. Different area each day. Different eye on it. Gerald noticed. Gary could tell by the barely perceptible shift in how Gerald's attention moved when Gary came through the loading bay door early. Not approval exactly. Recognition. Would you treat them with kindness? The acknowledgement of a habit that Gerald understood and respected because it was the same habit he had. Learned from someone who had learned it from someone else. Passed down not through words but through the act of doing it until it became how you thought. Nobody talked about any of this. Nobody needed to. The concrete sub arrived on day 9, which was a Monday, and their foreman was a man named Pete, who had the focused, slightly aggrieved energy of someone who spends his professional life cleaning up other people's errors. He looked at the column-based situation, did his own measurements, confirmed Gary's assessment, and said they could have the repour done in 4 days if the weather held. The weather held. 4 days later, the bases were poured, and the cure clock started, and Gary moved his attention fully to the West Bay and the center automotive section, where the work was progressing and where the crew's pace had, sometime in the 3rd week, shifted from deliberate to something closer to invested. Invested is different from deliberate. Deliberate means people are doing the job correctly. Invested means people are doing the job like it matters to them, that it turns out right, which is a quality you cannot manufacture in a crew and cannot buy with a 20% scale premium, though the premium helps. It comes from somewhere else, from the thing the project is for. Richard had been explaining it to people since the first day, not in speeches, not in announcements, in direct one-on-one conversations that Gary would catch fragments of while he was moving through the site. A kid who grew up on his block who couldn't sit still in a classroom, but could rebuild a carburetor at 16, and now did it in his driveway for cash. A nephew who wanted to learn to weld and couldn't find a training program that wasn't $8,000 in 12 months. Would you treat them with kindness? The fact that the trades were disappearing, not because young people didn't want them, but because there was nowhere left to go to learn them at the entry level, at the show-up-and-try level, without either expensive certification program or the kind of family connection that only gets you in if you're already in. Gary heard these conversations in pieces. He thought about them. He had gone to IIT on a partial scholarship that ran out after 3 years and student loans that hadn't run out, ever. He had learned what he knew about construction by doing it, starting at 19, with a summer job hauling debris for a demo company, and working his way through every trade he could get access to, over 9 years, because he understood early that knowing how something is built is the only reliable protection against being taken advantage of by someone who knows more than you. He had learned it the hard way, which is the only way it seems to stick. He understood what Richard was building. Not just the building. Laura came every Friday. That was the pattern now, established without discussion, simply the thing that happened. And the Carhartt jacket had replaced the trench coat, and the tablet had been gone for a month, and she moved through the warehouse now with the comfort of someone who had learned the geography of a place from the inside rather than from a schematic. She still observed. But the nature of the observation had changed. She was not monitoring an investment anymore. She was paying attention to something she had become interested in. She and Gary talked about the work, directly, specifically, as equals in the domain of the conversation, which Gary would not have kindness, would not have predicted after the white tablecloth and the checkbook. Would you treat them with kindness? But which was apparently what Laura Calhoun was like when she was not performing the role of person who must be defended against. She knew treat them with kindness. She knew the structural reports better than he expected. She had questions about the automotive bay lift installation that were well researched and operationally specific. When he explained the load path implications of the lift placement relative to the existing column grid, she listened without interrupting, and then asked a follow-up that demonstrated she had understood the first answer. Gary did not tell her he was surprised by any of this. That would have been condescending. He just answered her questions and noted internally that the woman who had run a background check on him and tried to buy him off in a restaurant was apparently also the woman who read structural reports on Friday mornings before driving to a construction site in a Carhartt jacket to ask specific questions about lift placement. People contain more than one thing. He had always known this in the abstract. It was something different to watch it demonstrate itself. On the Friday of fourth week, 3 days before the concrete cure clock hit 28 days and the East Bay framing could start going back up, Gary was hanging the last of the drywall in the management office. His arms were past tired and into the region of the body that has stopped sending complaints and started sending just silence. He had a screw gun in his right hand and a panel hold-up rod in his left, and he was working the top of a sheet into position against the ceiling framing, which is the most awkward and physically demanding position for hanging drywall, and which he was doing alone, because the 2 crew members who normally ran the drywall were finishing the West Bay partition walls, and Gary had told himself he'd get this one panel and then take a break. "You're holding the drill wrong." Gary stopped. The panel was half secured. He turned his head carefully because he had 4 screws in the sheet, and the panel would drop if he moved too much. Laura was standing in the doorway of the management office. Carhartt jacket, jeans, hair in a ponytail, not the severe knot of the restaurant, just a ponytail, which Gary had noticed was how she wore it now on site days. She had 2 paper bags from the taqueria on 18th Street in her hands, and she was looking at his elbow with the expression of someone who has identified a specific problem. "I am holding a panel above my head and trying not to drop it on my own face," Gary said. "What you're seeing is not a choice, it's physics. Your elbow is too low. You're fighting the torque of the driver instead of using the tool's weight. You're working twice as hard as you need to. Thank you. Very helpful. Tremendously useful feedback for the next 30 seconds. He finished driving the remaining screws, set the gun down, stepped back, and looked at the panel. Flat, flush, clean. He shook out his arms and turned around. Laura set the bags on the plywood sheet across the sawhorses, the same sheet that had held the inspection drawings, that had held the column base remediation plan, that had become the site's unofficial planning surface, and looked at him. Her expression was not aggressive. It was, Gary recognized with some delay, the expression of someone who wants to be right about something that is not very important and finds this entertaining. He crossed the room and held out the DeWalt impact driver. "Show me." She did not hesitate. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Which told Gary something about Laura Calhoun, that he had been accumulating evidence for over several weeks and was beginning to form into a coherent picture. She took the driver. She took a screw from his pouch. She had learned where the screw pouch was on the 3rd Friday she visited, the way you learn the geography of a workshop when you are paying attention to it. She stepped to the drywall. She lined up the screw with one of the existing lines, raised the driver, and pulled the trigger. The screw went in sideways. Instantly, the bit caught the paper face of the drywall, stripped it, skipped, and left a gouge an inch long in the surface of the panel, with a sound like a car skidding on gravel. Laura went very still. She looked at the gouge. She looked at the driver in her hand. She lowered her arm slowly. Then she started laughing. Not the managed, social laugh Gary had heard in the brief, unguarded moment at the restaurant. This was a real laugh. Unplanned. Starting somewhere in her chest and coming out with the slightly shocked quality of a person who is genuinely surprised by their own amusement. Gary watched it happen and felt something shift in the room at a frequency he wasn't entirely sure how to name. "Okay," Laura said when the laugh had run its course. Her voice was different than usual, lighter, like something had been set down. Spreadsheets and structural reports. Different category than carpentry. It takes practice. Gary took the driver back. He looked at the gouged panel. Salvageable, as long as the compound went on right. "Come here." She stepped closer. He handed the driver back. He positioned himself slightly behind her, and to the right. He reached out and tapped her right elbow, gently, with 2 fingers. Raised it, line with the bit, Let the weight of the tool sit in your shoulder, not your wrist. She adjusted. Now you're not fighting it. You're guiding it. She was still, paying attention the way she paid attention to things that interested her completely. When you're ready, she pulled the trigger. The screw went flush into the drywall with a clean, solid thunk that Gary felt in his own forearm. The satisfying sound of something working the way it's supposed to work. Laura held the driver in place for a half-second after the screw was in, like she needed to confirm what had just happened. Then she lowered her arm and looked at the screw, and Gary was close enough that he was aware of the space between them as a specific described thing. He stepped back, took the driver. "You're hired." Laura turned around. The drywall dust had found her cheek, a faint smudge of white on the left side of her face. She looked at him, and her eyes in the ambient light of the unfinished management office were the color of the thing they had been in the restaurant, but they were not the same eyes. The cynicism was gone. Or not gone, more like banked, set aside, present but not running the room. What was in its place was something Gary found considerably harder to navigate, which was just her looking at him without an angle. "Do I get the 20% hazard pay?" she said. "You get tacos." Gary gestured at the bags on the plywood. "Because I haven't eaten since 6 this morning, and if I don't eat in the next 10 minutes, something structural is going to fail, and it won't be the East Bay." They sat on the stack of lumber near the sawhorses and ate. Richard materialized from the back of the building. At some point he always materialized. Gary had stopped trying to track his movements, took a portion from one of the bags without commentary, looked at the management office drywall, said nothing, and went back to whatever he had been doing in the automotive bay, which, based on the sounds involved, appeared to be a dispute about whether a particular drill press Gary had not yet examined needed new brushes or a complete rewind. Gary watched Laura eat. She had a paper plate balanced on her knee. The Carhartt jacket was going to have taco grease on it, which she either hadn't noticed or didn't mind, and she was watching the far end of the warehouse where Richard's shadow moved against the bare concrete wall. "He's different out here," she said, "than he is at home. At home he's present. But here she seemed to look for the word. Awake. Like the lights are all on." Gary drank water from the bottle he kept in his jacket pocket and thought about that. Some people are built for the work. Not just willing to do it, built for it. They don't function the same way when they're not in it. Are you like that? He thought about the blueprint folder on the shelf above his desk, the shelf where he kept things he was working on, where it had been for 4 weeks now, still not open, but moved from the place it had been for 3 years. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I'm figuring out what I'm built for." Laura looked at him with the same directness she'd brought to the structural reports and the lift installation questions and the elbow position assessment, the directness that turned out to be the real version of something that in the restaurant had been pointed at him like a weapon. "You should open a firm," she said. "Commercial construction. You have what it takes. You ran this site through a foundation crisis and a crew who didn't know you, and you kept it moving. You need capital to start a firm. I know someone," she said it simply, looking at her plate, "who might be looking to diversify into commercial development. Community adjacent. The kind of projects this, a gesture at the warehouse around them, is a prototype for." Gary looked at her. "Laura, it's not charity." She looked up. Direct. Clear. "I run background checks. I don't make investments that don't have returns. And I don't make them because someone seems like a good person. I make them because the numbers work." A pause. "Your numbers work." Gary sat with that for a moment. The warehouse around them breathed with the sounds of material cooling in the December air, metal contracting, wood settling, the industrial heaters running in the West Bay, the sound of a city outside that was full of buildings that needed to be built correctly and a diminishing number of people who knew how. "I want my own lawyer to review any agreement before it's finalized," Gary said. Laura nodded without hesitation. "Obviously. And I want the right of first refusal on any project where I have a conflict of conscience with the build quality or the code compliance." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not surprise, not amusement. Something more like the internal registration of a characteristic confirmed. That's a significant ask. I know. I'll consider it. Which meant yes. Gary had been reading what people decide before they say it long enough to know what "I'll consider it" means from someone who says no without softening it when they mean no. He looked at the warehouse, at what had been built here over 6 weeks, at the management office with its freshly hung drywall and the east bay nearly ready for its second and final framing, at the woodworking stations taking shape in the west bay, the steel tool rails going up, the ventilation for the finishing area going in over the next week. He thought about 19-year-olds standing at those stations, learning something real, something that would hold up. He thought about his father. And he thought for the first time in 3 years, not about whether he deserved the thing he wanted, but about whether he was ready to stop pretending he didn't want it. The blueprint folder was on the shelf above his desk. Open or closed, it was there, and things that are there have a way of demanding eventually to be dealt with. The East Bay framing went back up on a Tuesday, 28 days after the concrete sub poured the corrected column bases. Gary arrived at the warehouse at 5:45 in the morning and stood in the loading bay with a cup of coffee from the gas station on Halstead and looked at the cured concrete at the base of each east column and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a problem that has been correctly solved. Not quickly, not cheaply, correctly. The distinction mattered to him in a way he had stopped trying to explain to people who didn't already understand it. Gerald arrived at 6:10. Which was early for Gerald, who was punctual to the minute but not habitually ahead of schedule. He came in through the loading bay, walked directly to the east column line, crouched next to the nearest base pour, and looked at it the way he looked at everything, with total, unhurried attention, as if the concrete might say something if given enough silence to work with. Then he stood up and looked at Gary. Clean pour. Pete's crew is good. Gerald nodded once. Signton. That was the whole conversation, which was how Gerald handled most things that were going well, which was through the efficient application of silence. By 7, the full crew was in and the East Bay framing sequence had begun, and the warehouse was alive with the specific organized noise of a site that knows what it's doing. Gary moved through it, checking connections, treat them with kindness. Talking to the electrician about the conduit run through the east soffit, which needed to be coordinated with the framing schedule, or they'd be doing it twice. Confirming the lumber delivery that was arriving at 9 was the correct grade SPF number 2, stamped, no substitutions, and Gary would be looking at every stamp himself before a stick of it went up, because he had learned, at a cost of 6 weeks and $180,000 of Richard Calhoun's money, that trusting previous GCs to have ordered correctly was an act of faith that the universe did not reward. Richard arrived at 6:55. Thermos, canvas jacket, Cubs hat. He walked the floor without speaking to anyone for the first 20 minutes, which was his version of a morning meeting, and then settled into the automotive bay where he had been spending most of his time, engaged in a running philosophical dispute with the automotive equipment installer about the optimal of the two-post lift relative to the compressed air supply line. The installer, a man in his late 40s named Dale, who had set up automotive bays in shops across 3 states, had a technical opinion about this. Richard had a different technical opinion. Neither of them was entirely wrong. Gary had stopped mediating this particular argument in week 4 because they were both enjoying it too much, and the lift was eventually going to end up in the right place regardless. The framing went up clean. All of it. By the end of the first day, the East Bay structure was roughed in, and Gerald had walked it twice and said nothing critical, which from Gerald meant it was correct. By the end of the 3rd day, the rough framing was complete, and the rough-in for electrical and mechanical was underway, and Gary stood in the middle of the East Bay and looked up at the framing overhead and felt the building begin to close in around its own skeleton. The transition from structure to space that always happened somewhere in the middle of a job and always hit him the same way, like watching something decide to become what it was always going to be. He did not tell anyone this. It would have been difficult to explain. The weeks compressed the way they do when the work is going right. December in Chicago is not a gentle month. The temperature dropped into the single digits twice in the third week, and the industrial heaters in the West Bay and the automotive section were working at capacity, and the loading bay doors had to be managed carefully to keep the interior temperature consistent enough that the drywall compound would cure properly. Gary and Gerald developed a system for this, involving a rotating schedule of partial door openings, timed to the delivery windows, and the exterior temperature forecasts, which Gary checked every morning on his phone, and which Gerald seemed to know instinctively and independently through some atmospheric sense that Gary did not possess, but had learned to respect. The management office was done by the second week of December. Drywall finished, taped, mudded, primed. Would you treat them with kindness? The clean off-white that Richard had selected with the same deliberate certainty he brought to lumber grades and coffee temperature. Gary had hung the last panel himself. The one with the gouge in it salvaged, compounded over, sanded smooth, painted. You could not find the repair if you didn't know where to look. Gary knew where to look. And sometimes he looked at it and thought about the laugh that had come out of Laura in that unguarded moment, and the way the room had changed temperature when it happened. She kept coming on Fridays. The Carhartt jacket was permanent now. The hair was always the ponytail on site days. She and Gary had developed a working language around the project that was specific and efficient, and occasionally, in the past 2 weeks, had started containing other things, not obvious things. Just the extra beat of a pause. The way a question would be asked about something they both already knew the answer to, because asking it was the point rather than the answer. Would you treat them with kindness? Gary noticed these things and filed them without acting on them because he was running a construction site through December in Chicago, and he had approximately zero personal bandwidth for anything that required interpretation. Or so he told himself. Which was not entirely true. But it was the thing he told himself, and it was functional, so he kept telling it. The East Bay was complete on a Thursday in the third week of December. All of it. Framing, electrical rough-in, mechanical, insulation, drywall, the epoxy floor coating on the concrete that would hold up to the kind of use a working woodshop produces. The equipment was already in the West Bay, and the automotive section, the drill presses and band saws and table saw stations, and the 2-post lift that Dale had finally installed, in the position that both he and Richard had agreed upon, which was roughly the position Dale had originally recommended, and which Richard claimed was also his original position, a claim that Dale did not dispute out loud. Gary stood in the East Bay on Thursday afternoon, alone after the crew had packed up, the heaters running, the floor coat still off-gassing slightly, a sharp chemical clean smell that Gary associated with finished work, the woodworking stations along the north wall, the metal fabrication stations along the south, all of it in place, all of it real. He had walked through buildings before that he had worked on, had that experience of moving through a completed space and finding the work in it, the wall he had framed, the floor he had leveled, the window he had set. But this was different. This was a building he had run from the inside out. His decisions were structural here, not just labor. The column bases, the framing sequence, the mechanical coordination, the finish schedule. 3 with kindness? 3 months of decisions layered into the walls and the floor and the ceiling overhead, and it was standing, and it was correct, and it was going to stand for 50 years. Which is the thing he had promised the crew on the day the inspector came and the project nearly went sideways. And he had meant it when he said it, and now it was true. He took a photograph with his phone. Just the East Bay. No particular composition. Not for anyone else. For the file he kept in his head of things that had actually happened the way they were supposed to happen. He turned off the lights and locked up. The morning of the opening was a Saturday. Clear and cold, and the kind of bright that only happens in December when the air has been scoured by a week of wind and there is no humidity left in it to scatter the light. Gary got to the warehouse at 7, 2 hours before the first participants were scheduled to arrive, and spent the time doing a final walk of every station, every tool position, every electrical outlet and compressed air connection and safety eye wash station that he had been responsible for specifying. Nothing wrong. Everything in its place. He stood in the automotive bay and looked at the two-post lift in its final, agreed-upon position, and felt a quiet pleasure that had no adequate name. Richard arrived at 7:45, which was late for Richard, who was almost always the first person anywhere. He came in through the side door, rather than the loading bay, and he was not wearing the canvas jacket. He was wearing a flannel shirt, work pants. His Cubs hat was the same. In his hand was the battered steel thermos. He walked into the automotive bay and stood next to Gary and looked at the lift and the tool stations and the compressed air lines running clean along the ceiling. "Dale did work on the install," Gary said. "I helped." "You supervised." "I supervised and helped." Richard poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to Gary. "There's a difference." Gary took the coffee. "Would you treat them with kindness?" They stood in the automotive bay, and the morning light came through the east windows at a low angle and put long shadows across the epoxy floor, and it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as significant, but which Gary already understood he would remember. Richard looked at the building around them, a slow full turn, taking in all of it. The weight of the moment was visible on the old man's face, not as sentimentality. Richard was not a sentimental person in any performative sense. Would you treat them with kindness? But as the particular expression of someone who has been building towards something for a very long time and has arrived at it and is allowing himself to know that. "My wife would have liked this," Richard said, quietly, not to Gary exactly, just out loud in a room where Gary happened to be. Gary did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would have improved on the silence. Richard drank his coffee, set the thermos on the workbench. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it without making a face. I'll do my best. I was in the parking lot of the Meridian room the day Laura went instead of me. Gary went still. I sat in the truck." Richard looked at the east windows. "She intercepted my schedule that morning, which she believed I didn't know about, which I knew about by 9:15. 'Cause Sarah at the front desk calls me when someone uses my name to make a reservation they don't end up using." He paused. "I knew she was going. I let her go." The light moved on the epoxy floor. The heater in the corner of the bay cycled on with a low rush of warm air. "I needed to know who you were before I could offer you anything," Richard said. "I'd made that mistake once. The trust, the open door, the man I treated like he started again. After that, I didn't trust my own judgment about people anymore. So I let Laura run her process. Because her process is rigorous and I'm not. And I needed the result." Gary stood with this for a moment, turned it over. "You were going to let her buy me off?" "I was going to let the situation tell me what it needed to tell me." Richard looked at him directly. "If you had taken the check, she would have been right about you. And I would have been wrong. And I would have been wrong. And I would have driven home, and that would have been that. A beat, but I watched you come out of that building." He did not say what Gary's face had looked like coming out of that building. He didn't need to. Gary knew what it had looked like. It had looked like a man who had just pushed a $10,000 check back across a white tablecloth and was walking out into 30-degree air and was not sure if he was righteous or just broke and was choosing to believe the former because the alternative was unbearable. "If I had taken it," Gary said. "You didn't. But if." Richard looked at him steadily. "Then you'd have taken it, and Laura would have been right, and I would have gone home." He picked up the thermos. "I don't traffic in hypotheticals, Gary. Things happened the way they happened. I watched you walk out of that building, and I went home, and I called the lawyers about the warehouse permit the next morning." Gary looked at the east windows, the light, the long shadows on the floor. "You were testing me. I was reading you. There's a difference." Richard screwed the cap onto the thermos. "A test has a designed outcome. Reading someone just tells you what they are." He started toward the side door. "The first 3 participants arrive at 9. I'd like the stations checked before then." He walked out. Gary stood in the automotive bay alone for a moment. The heater ran. The light moved. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about the parking lot and the rain and the cast iron saw and the coffee in the thermos cap, and the way Richard had looked at him in the moment before he'd given Gary his number, the evaluation, the decision, and understood that what he had taken for a stubborn old man's pride had been something more complicated than that. A man who had been badly burned, putting his trust in the wrong person, testing a replacement hypothesis about the right person, carefully and at distance, before he was willing to believe his own judgment again. Gary understood this better than he would have 3 months ago. Before the column bases, before the crew and Gerald and Pete and Dale, and the dozen decisions that had been his to make and that had needed to be made correctly. He was not the same contractor who had walked into the Meridian room in his navy button-down. He was not dramatically different, just calibrated, the way a tool gets calibrated when it's been used for the right work. He went and checked the stations. The first participants arrived at 9:15. 19 young adults, 19 to 24, sent by 3 vocational programs and 2 community centers on the south and west sides of Chicago. Would you treat them with kindness? People who had been identified by their instructors and caseworkers as having aptitude and interest in skilled trades and nowhere adequate to develop either. They came in small groups of 2 and 3, in winter coats, some of them with the slightly defended posture of people who have been in enough institutional settings to suspect that this one will also disappoint them in some specific way. Richard did not hold a ceremony. There was no ribbon, no speech. Gary had asked about this specifically. Would you treat them with kindness? In the week leading up to the opening, whether Richard wanted some kind of formal launch event, and Richard had looked at him with the expression Gary had come to recognize as Richard's response to questions whose answers he considered self-evident. They came to learn how to use tools, Richard had said. Not to watch me talk, so. 9:15, Saturday morning, December in Chicago. Richard walked from the side door to the woodworking section without looking at anyone in particular and without announcement, and he switched on the dust collection system, which hummed to life with a low sustained note that the warehouse held cleanly due to the acoustic treatment. Gary had specified for the ceiling in the woodworking section, a detail that had seemed minor during the design phase and turned out to matter considerably in practice. Richard picked up a piece of rough walnut from the material rack, a board about 18 inches long, and carried it to the nearest workbench. He set it down. He looked at the young man standing closest to him, who was maybe 20, in a Carhartt jacket that was newer than Gary's, with the particular stillness of someone trying to appear calm. You know what this is? Richard indicated the board. The young man looked at it. Walnut. Black walnut. Know the difference? Not really. Good. Neither did I at your age. Richard picked up a handplane from the tool rack. Come here. The young man came. Richard put the plane in his hands, adjusted his grip without explaining why, positioned him at the bench, and said, Go. The young man ran the plane across the walnut, and the shaving curled off in a long, continuous ribbon, and the young man stopped and looked at it with an expression that Gary recognized because it was the expression of someone who has just done something physical for the first time that worked the way it was supposed to work, and found that it felt completely different than they had expected, completely different than sitting in front of a screen. Completely different than anything that comes without resistance. Gary stood near the east wall and watched this happen. He watched it happen at the metalworking stations. Would you treat them with kindness? Where 2 of the crew members Gary had kept on, as instructors were demonstrating TIG welding, set up to 3 participants who were watching with the quality of attention you only see in people who genuinely want to understand something. He watched it happen in the automotive bay, where Dale had agreed to run the first session on lift safety and basic drivetrain inspection. Would you treat them with kindness? And where a young woman of 22 with a background in community college automotive theory was correcting Dale on a torque specification after 20 minutes, which Dale took with remarkable good grace and which Gary suspected would result in a job offer before the end of the month. Laura arrived at 10, not in the Carhartt jacket. She was wearing a wool coat, charcoal, the kind that costs what it costs and doesn't apologize for it. Her hair was down. Not styled, just down. The dark hair, loose around her shoulders in the way that the ponytail and the severe restaurant knot had both been variations on keeping it contained, and this was the version that was not contained. She came in through the loading bay and stood at the edge of the main floor and looked at the room. At her father running a hand plane demonstration for 4 participants who had gathered without being asked. At the welding stations. At the automotive bay. Her expression was not what Gary expected. Not the satisfaction of a successful investment. Not the assessment of a CEO reviewing a project outcome. Something quieter than either of those. Something that looked, from where Gary was standing, like a person who has been braced against a particular kind of loss for so long that the absence of it takes a moment to locate and name. She found Gary with her eyes and crossed the floor to him. "It's full," she said. "We have 19 participants for the first session. 34 on the waiting list for February. He'll be here every day." "I know. Would you treat them with kindness?" She looked at Richard, who had moved from the handplane demonstration to the bandsaw station, where he was explaining the blade tension adjustment to a 20-year-old who was listening with the specific absorption of someone who learns by watching hands. "He used to get to the office at 5:30, Laura said. "Every day. Before the building opened, before the cleaning crew left. My mother used to say he didn't sleep, he just waited for it to be late enough to go back." She paused. "After she died, he started sleeping 12 hours. Not because he was tired. Because there was nowhere to be at 5:30 anymore." Gary looked at Richard at the bandsaw station. The old man's hands were moving over the machine, with the fluency of 60 years, adjusting, demonstrating, not explaining more than was necessary, letting the mechanism speak for itself. He looked like a man who had found his 5:30 again. "He's good at this," Gary said. "He always was. He just forgot for a while." Laura looked at the floor plan she had reviewed in Gary's apartment, now manifested in 3 dimensions around her. "You built this exactly as he drew it. The drawing was good. He'll want to expand. The second floor eventually. More programs. The second floor structural load is rated for it. I spec'd it that way." Laura looked at him. "You planned for the expansion." "Richard planned for it. I read what the drawing was asking for." She was quiet for a moment. The warehouse moved around them. 19 people learning things with their hands for the first time, or for the first time in a serious way, in a building that had been built correctly, in a city that needed more of both of those things. Gary looked them with kindness, and thought that there are certain mornings that don't announce themselves as the kind you will carry, but which announce themselves afterward in retrospect, as the kind that changed the shape of what came next. Laura reached into the interior pocket of the charcoal wool coat and took out a folder. Letter size, plain manila, the kind you buy in bulk at an office supply store, and which contains things that are not plain at all. She held it out. Gary took it, opened it. 12 pages, printed, with the Calhoun Freight Solutions letterhead at the top of the first page, and below it, in the format Gary had come to recognize from 9 years of reading contracts that affected his work, an investment agreement. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He read the first page standing in the middle of the warehouse floor, while around him 19 people were learning to use their hands, and Richard was adjusting a band saw blade, and the December light came through the east windows at an angle that said the morning was not going to last. He read all 12 pages. It took 11 minutes. He knew it took 11 minutes because he checked his phone at the start out of habit, and again at the end when he looked up. Laura waited without appearing to wait, which was a skill Reed had noticed that she had the ability to be patient in a way that didn't look like patience, that looked like simply being present in a moment without requiring anything from it. The terms were what she had described. Investment capital for a commercial construction firm. 3 projects, community adjacent, in Chicago and 2 suburban municipalities, with Gary as GC. Performance milestones. A withdrawal clause triggered if the first project did not meet specifications, on time, within 10% of budget, not a gift. A bet written in legal language, with the particular clarity of someone who writes contracts for a living, and understands that ambiguity costs more than precision. He turned to the last page. The signature line. Her name was already there, signed in the same practiced hand that had written the check in the Meridian Room, except this time the document was 12 pages of obligations and benchmarks, rather than an exit payment, and his name was the one that would determine whether those benchmarks were met. He looked at the signature. He looked at Laura. "I want to add a clause," he said. She looked at him without expression. "What clause?" "Right of refusal on any project where compliance with building code or safety specifications is in conflict with the budget or the timeline." He held her gaze. "From any direction, including from the investing party." The warehouse moved around them. Laura looked at the clause he had described, not at the page. In her head, where she was reading it in the specific way that people who think in contract language read things when they hear them spoken aloud, her eyes moved slightly, tracking something internal. "That clause gives you unilateral authority to refuse a project I've committed capital to," she said. "Yes. That's a significant commercial risk for the investing party. I know. You understand that most contractors would not ask for that." "I'm not most contractors." She looked at him. The green eyes, the ones that, in the restaurant, had been surgical, and in the warehouse doorway on the first Friday had been observational, and at the band, saw, demonstration had been something Gary was still finding the right word for, were now doing the thing they did when Richard Calhoun was making a real decision, which was going completely still, no performance in them, just the thinking itself visible on the surface. "If I include that clause," she said slowly, "I need a reciprocal disclosure obligation. Any refusal has to come with written technical documentation of the specific code or safety concern within 48 hours. Agreed. And the documentation has to be signed by a licensed engineer. Agreed. And you're paying for the engineer. Agreed." Another beat. Laura looked at the folder in his hands. "You realize you negotiated that in 30 seconds. I knew what I was going to ask for. How long have you known?" Gary thought about it. "Since you handed me the folder." She looked at him with the expression he had been trying to find the right word for. He found it standing in the middle of the warehouse, with the December light lit on the epoxy floor, and Richard's voice carrying from the band saw station and 19 people learning things nearby. The expression was respect. The real kind. The kind that isn't polite and isn't performed and doesn't cost nothing. The kind that gets paid for with the accumulated evidence of what a person actually does when it counts. "I'll have the revised agreement to you by Wednesday," she said. "I'll have my lawyer review it by Friday. I already know who your lawyer is." A corner of her mouth moved. "I ran a background check." Gary looked at her. "You ran a background check on my lawyer." "I run background checks on everyone relevant to agreements I'm signing." The corner of her mouth moved again, more this time. Not quite a smile. "The precursor to one. It's a policy. You said it wasn't a policy last time. You said it was just who you are. That was about your father. Your father. My father." "Yes." The smile arrived. The real one. The one that had appeared in the management office when the screw went sideways and that Gary had been thinking about at inconvenient intervals ever since. "My father power is not a policy. He is a category unto himself." From across the warehouse, Richard's voice, "Morrow, come look at this blade." Gary looked at Laura. She was looking at him. "Go," she said. "He'll come get you if you don't." He went. The blade Richard wanted him to look at was on the old band saw in the woodworking section. One of the vintage machines Richard had sourced from estate sales and industrial auctions over the preceding 3 months, refurbished by hand, calibrated with the same obsessive precision he brought to every mechanism he loved. The blade was slightly fatigued near the weld. Gary could see it when Richard pointed it out, a hairline variation in the set of the teeth near the joint. Richard had caught it during the demonstration. He had stopped the machine before the participant tried to run a cut. "Swap it before the afternoon session," Richard said. Already on it. Gary had the replacement blades in the supply room he'd specified in the back corner of the East Bay. He looked at Richard. "You were watching the blade during the demonstration." "I was watching the demonstration and the blade." Richard looked at the participant, a 22-year-old, who was now running a different machine under the supervision of one of the instructors, unconcerned. "That's what you do when you're responsible for something. So, you watch all of it." Gary changed the blade. He did it the way he did everything on this site himself, by hand. Because the things that are done by hand with full attention are the things that stay done. The afternoon session ran from 1 to 4. Different participants. A second cohort from 2 of the programs. 12 people this time. And the energy in the warehouse was different than the morning, in the specific way that afternoon energy is different from morning energy, more worn in. The new space tension replaced by something that was already starting to feel like routine. Would you treat them with kindness? Richard moved through both sessions with the stamina of someone who had been waiting to spend this energy for years and had saved up enough of it to last. At 4 o'clock, the power with kindness. Participants cleared out and the instructors locked down their stations, and Gerald, who had come in on his own time, because that was apparently the kind of person Gerald was, walked the floor one final time and found nothing that needed correcting and reported this to no one in particular and left. Gary was in the management office, at the desk, going through the punch list for the items that still needed sign-off. 3 minor electrical cover plate finishes in the East Bay, a door closer on the automotive bay fire door that needed adjustment. The parking lot lighting. Gary was coordinating with the city when Richard appeared in the doorway. He looked tired. Not the broken-down kind of tired, the satisfied kind. The kind that comes from a day of real work done right. "Good day," Richard said. "Good day," Gary said. Richard looked at the office. The walls Gary had hung. The desk that was a simple contractor's table Richard had bought from a restaurant supply liquidator because it was solid and cheap and didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. The window overlooking the main floor. Would you treat this? Which had been Gary's specification. The manager's office should be able to see the whole floor. He had told Richard, would you treat them with kindness? Because the person running this place should always be able to see what's happening in it. "You talked to Laura," Richard said. "She gave me the agreement." "I know. I read the draft." He looked at Gary. "The clause you're going to ask for. About the code compliance." Gary looked at him. "She told you." "She called me from the car." Richard shrugged. "She tells me things." He looked at the window, the floor below, the stations in their end-of-day silence. "I would have written that clause in myself. She wouldn't let me. Said it would make the agreement look like a favor." He paused. "You asking for it makes it a negotiation." Gary sat with that. "She's been trying to protect me from bad judgment for 4 years, Richard said. His voice was matter-of-fact. Not grieving, just accurate. But she picked up my habits while she was doing it. The suspicion. The background checks. He moved one thick hand in a gesture that conveyed something about armor and what it cost to wear it all the time. She got so good at protecting me that she forgot to leave room for the possibility that sometimes people are just people." "She's getting there," Gary said. "She got there faster with you than I expected." Richard looked at him with the pale blue eyes. Evaluating. The same look from the parking lot, except Gary understood now what it was looking for. "That's a compliment." In case it wasn't clear, it was clear. Richard nodded. He picked up his thermos from the edge of the desk, where he had set it at some point without Gary noticing, because Richard Calhoun moved through spaces and left things in them the way weather moves through and leaves evidence behind. He walked to the door, stopped. "The second floor," he said. "I want to start the planning drawings in February. I'll need a site manager." Gary looked at him. "I'll be running my own firm by February." "I know." Richard did not turn around. "I'm talking to the firm." He walked out of the management office and down the stairs, and Gary heard his boots on the main floor, the particular weight and rhythm of them. The sound of a man who moves through a building like he knows what it's made of. Gary sat in the management office for a while. The afternoon had gone dark outside, and the warehouse was lit by the work lights, amber and steady, and the shadows on the main floor were long. He could see through the window the stations in their arranged order, the tools in their places. The walnut shaving still on the workbench near the band saw no one had swept it up, and somehow it looked right there, like evidence of the first thing. He pulled out his phone, looked at the number for his lawyer, a woman named Patricia Stokes, who had been doing contract review for small business clients on the Northwest Side for 20 years, and who charged fair rates and asked good questions and had never once told Gary that something was probably fine without actually reading it first. He typed, "I'll have a commercial investment agreement to you by Wednesday." 12 pages plus a handwritten clause amendment. I need it turned around by Friday. He sent it. Patricia texted back in 4 minutes, done. New rate applies. Which was fair. He put his phone away. He stood up and walked to the window and looked at the floor below, at what had been built here. 3 months. His decisions in the walls. His judgment in the structure. His promise in the 50-year frame of the thing. He thought about his father. Not with the weight he usually kindness. Not with the weight he usually carried it. The specific weight of a man who was not there, and a door that had not been answered, and a life that had gone a different direction than anyone planned. He thought about his father, the way he thought about things that had happened and shaped you, and that you carry not as burden, but as architecture. The thing that determines where the weight goes when the load comes. He took the stairs down. He walked the floor. He turned off the work lights section by section. West Bay to East Bay to automotive. The warehouse going dark in stages. He came out through the loading bay, and the December night was sharp and clear, and the stars were the kind you only see when it's cold enough that the sky is clean all the way up. He sat in the van for a moment. The blueprint folder was on the passenger seat. He had put it there that morning, for reasons he had not fully articulated to himself. After 3 years on the coffee table and 4 weeks on the shelf above his desk, the navy cardboard soft at the corners, 43 pages folded into an old life that had not stopped being his, just because he had stopped looking at it. He picked it up, opened it. The paper inside was architectural bond, the good kind, and it had held up. His drafting was careful, the way you draft when you're 20 years old and still believe that care produces permanence. The floor plan on the first page was for a building on a corner lot, mixed use, retail below and residential above, with a courtyard that caught southern light, and a courtyard, a structural grid that gave the interior flexibility without sacrificing the load path. He had drawn it for an assignment, and then kept drawing it after the assignment was finished, because he wasn't done with it. He hadn't changed anything fundamental in 3 years. He'd just stopped looking at it. He looked at it now, with the eyes of someone who had run a build-out from foundation to finish. Would you treat them with kindness? With the eyes of someone who had read a load path correctly in the field and caught a lumber grade error before it became a structural failure, and stood in front of a crew and made decisions that needed to be made and made them right. The drawing was good, not perfect. The courtyard proportions were off and the structural grid needed adjustment in the corner bays. But the bones were right. The idea was right. The building in the drawing was worth building. He sat with it for a long time. The warehouse behind him was dark. The street was quiet. Somewhere on the block a porch light was on against the cold. Would you treat them with kindness? One warm square of yellow in the winter dark, and it looked like what it was, which was a person inside somewhere who had turned a light on because they were expecting someone, or because they had decided it was better to have the light on than to not have it on. He put the drawings back in the folder. He started the van. The heat came up slowly, the way the heat always comes up in the van, but it came up. He had a meeting with his lawyer on Friday. He had a revised agreement coming Wednesday. Would you treat them with kindness? He had a site manager's position on expansion that would start in February, and he had 43 pages of a building that was still worth building if he was willing to get back to work on it. He pulled out of the parking space and drove north on Halstead, and the city opened up ahead of him, lit and cold and enormous and indifferent and full of buildings that needed to be built by people who understood the difference between doing something fast and doing it right. He understood that difference. He had understood it for a long time. He had just been waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting, for the work that was large enough to prove it. Behind him, in the loading bay of the Pilsen warehouse, Richard Calhoun's F-150 sat in the dark. The red paint faded to dried brick, the rust patient at the wheel wells, the engine cold now but still capable. Still there. Still the truck that had started all of it, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in a parking lot on the south side, with a cast iron saw, and 2 strangers and a cup of black coffee. Still, improbably, exactly what it needed to be.